The summer heat of 1847 shimmered off the Texas prairie like a living thing, distorting the horizon where two worlds were about to collide in ways no one could have imagined. In the dusty settlement of Cedar Ridge, 23-year-old Sarah, Elizabeth Morgan, stood at her cabin window, watching the approaching dust cloud that would change everything she thought she knew about survival, honor, and the true meaning of strength. What happened next would defy every assumption held by both the Comanche Nation and the white settlers of the Texas frontier. A treaty payment that was meant to prevent a war would instead forge an alliance that would save two peoples from destruction, led by a woman who refused to be anyone's possession and a war chief who discovered that true power sometimes means knowing when not to use it. This is the story of how Sarah Morgan became the bridge between two worlds, and how Chief Running Bear learned that the greatest victories are won not through conquest, but through understanding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Elizabeth Morgan had always known that life on the Texas frontier demanded impossible choices, but she never imagined that she herself would become the currency in a desperate gamble for peace. The morning of July 15th, 1847, dawned clear and mercilessly hot, the kind of day that made even the hardiest settlers question their decision to carve a life from the unforgiving prairie. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she shared with her father, Colonel James Morgan, watching him pace the length of their small porch with the restless energy of a man carrying the weight of an entire settlement's survival. At 48, the colonel bore the weathered look of someone who had spent the better part of 2 decades fighting Indians, Mexicans, and the land itself. But Sarah had never seen him look as haggard as he did this morning. "The Comanche delegation will be here within the hour," he said, not for the first time, his hand unconsciously moving to the pistol at his hip. Chief Running Bear isn't known for his patience or his mercy. If these negotiations fail, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah had grown up hearing stories of Comanche raids, of settlements burned to the ground, and families scattered to the winds. Cedar Ridge, with its 43 families and modest stockade, would last perhaps an hour against a full war party led by the most feared chief on the southern plains. "Father," Sarah said quietly, stepping onto the porch beside him, "you've done everything possible to prepare for this meeting. The territorial governor himself approved the terms you're offering." Colonel Morgan's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Cattle, horses, rifles, ammunition, and trade goods worth more than this. Entire settlement, and it still might not be enough." He turned to look at his daughter, his weathered face creased with worry that went deeper than simple concern for military strategy. "Running Bear has lost 3 war parties to cavalry ambushes this spring. His people are hungry, angry, and looking for someone to blame. The usual treaty gifts won't satisfy them this time." Sarah had inherited her father's steel-gray eyes and his stubborn determination, but where his experience had taught him to expect the worst from any situation, her 23 years had not yet crushed her fundamental belief that reasonable people could find reasonable solutions to even the most complex problems. It was a difference in perspective that had led to countless arguments between them over the years. But today she sensed something different in his manner, a desperation that suggested he was considering options he had never been willing to discuss before. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked, recognizing the signs of a man wrestling with a decision he didn't want to make. Before Colonel Morgan could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the settlement's main gate. 3 riders approached under a white flag, their movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the dozen rifle barrels that tracked their progress from the stockade walls. Sarah felt her breath catch as she got her first clear look at the legendary Comanche war chief, whose name had become synonymous with swift, devastating raids across the Texas frontier. Running Bear sat his painted warhorse with the casual grace of someone who had been born in the saddle, his presence commanding attention even at a distance. He appeared to be perhaps 30 years old, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of lean muscle that came from a lifetime of warfare and survival on the open plains. His long black hair was adorned with eagle feathers that marked significant victories, and the scars visible on his chest and arms told the story of a man who had never asked others to face dangers he wouldn't embrace himself. But it was his eyes that caught Sarah's attention and held it. Even across the distance that separated them, she could see an intelligence that belied the savage reputation that preceded him. A calculating awareness that suggested this man was far more than the mindless killer portrayed in frontier newspapers and military reports. The two warriors who flanked him were equally impressive, their weapons held ready but not threatening, their bearings suggesting complete confidence in their chief's ability to handle whatever situation might develop. As they approached the settlement's gates, Sarah noticed the way they moved as a unit, each man aware of his companion's positions and ready to react instantly to any threat. "That's him," Colonel Morgan said unnecessarily, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and apprehension. 27 years old, and already the most successful war leader the Comanche have produced in a generation. They say he's never lost a battle, never failed to bring his warriors home from a raid. Sarah studied the approaching chief with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on understanding the man she was observing. What she saw challenged every assumption she had formed about Comanche warriors based on frontier stories and military reports. This was not a mindless savage driven by bloodlust and hatred. This was a leader, a strategist, someone who had succeeded in the most demanding profession imaginable through intelligence, courage, and the ability to inspire absolute loyalty in his followers. "He's younger than I expected," she said. "Don't let that fool you," her father replied grimly. "He became a war chief at 19 by killing the previous leader in single combat after the man made a strategic error that cost them half a war party. Running Bear has been leading successful raids against Mexican and American settlements for 8 years. The fact that he's willing to negotiate at all suggests that the situation for his people is more desperate than we realized." The delegation halted at the settlement's gates, waiting with patient dignity for permission to enter. It was a courtesy that surprised many of the settlers who had gathered to witness the historic meeting, their preconceptions about Comanche behavior challenged by the chief's obvious respect for proper diplomatic protocol. Colonel Morgan straightened his uniform jacket and checked his sidearm one final time before walking toward the gates. "Stay here, Sarah. This isn't a conversation for civilians." But Sarah had no intention of remaining safely out of sight while the fate of everyone she cared about was decided by men who had spent years viewing each other as mortal enemies. She followed her father at a discreet distance, positioning herself where she could observe the proceedings while remaining safely within the settlement's defenses. The gates opened slowly, and Running Bear guided his horse through the entrance with calm confidence, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the settlement's layout, defenses, and inhabitants. Sarah noticed that he paid particular attention to the positions of armed settlers and the condition of their weapons, his assessment as thorough and professional as any military reconnaissance. When he dismounted near the settlement's central square, where a rough table had been set up for the negotiations, Running Bear moved with the fluid grace of a natural athlete. He was taller than Sarah had realized, probably close to 6 feet, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention even when he wasn't speaking. "Colonel Morgan," he said, in heavily accented but perfectly understandable English. His voice, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I come under flag of truce to hear your words about peace between our peoples." Sarah's father stepped forward, every inch the professional soldier despite the sweat that beaded on his forehead. "Chief Running Bear, I'm honored by your presence and grateful for your willingness to discuss terms that might prevent further bloodshed." The formal exchange continued for several minutes, each man carefully observing the protocols that governed such meetings while simultaneously assessing his opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Sarah found herself fascinated by the interplay between the two leaders, recognizing in both men the kind of iron determination that had allowed them to survive and prosper in an environment that offered little mercy for weakness or indecision. But as the conversation moved from diplomatic pleasantries to substantive discussions of territory, trade rights, and compensation for past grievances, Sarah began to sense an undercurrent of tension that suggested the standard terms would not be sufficient to secure the peace both sides desperately needed. Running Bear listened with patient attention as Colonel Morgan outlined the territorial government's offer: cattle, horses, agricultural tools, trade goods, and a modest annual payment in silver. It was a generous package by frontier standards, representing a significant investment in maintaining peaceful relations with the most powerful Comanche band in the region. When the colonel finished his presentation, Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the settlement's walls as he considered what he had heard. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had spent considerable time thinking about the impossible situation facing his people. "Your words are honest, Colonel, and your offer shows respect for Comanche strength," he said, slowly. "But my warriors have lost brothers to your cavalry. My people have watched their hunting grounds shrink as more white settlers claim land that has belonged to us since the beginning of time. They ask me why we should make peace with those who take everything and offer so little in return." Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the fundamental problem that no amount of traditional treaty goods could solve. The Comanche were not simply angry about specific incidents or territorial disputes. They were facing the gradual destruction of their entire way of life, and no gift of cattle or silver could compensate for that loss. Colonel Morgan seemed to understand the same thing. "Chief, what would your people consider adequate compensation for the peace we both need?" Running Bear's answer would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. "My warriors demand something more valuable than cattle or silver, Colonel. They want proof that the white man's word carries meaning, that this treaty will be honored when others have been broken. They want—" He paused, his eyes moving across the assembled settlers before fixing on Sarah herself. "A bond that cannot be undone. A guarantee written in blood and honor." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt every eye in the settlement turned toward her as the implications of the chief's words became clear. In the complex diplomacy of frontier warfare, such bonds often took forms that civilized society found difficult to accept. "What exactly are you proposing?" Colonel Morgan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it confirmed. "My warriors will accept your treaty goods and your promises of peace," Running Bear said, with the calm certainty of a man who had already considered every aspect of what he was about to propose. "But they also demand a hostage, someone whose safety will guarantee your good faith, someone whose value to you will ensure that you honor every word of our agreement." He gestured toward Sarah with a slight movement of his head. "Your daughter, Colonel. She will come with us as surety for your promises. Treat us with honor, and she will be treated with honor. Break your word," and he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Sarah felt the world tilt around her as she realized that she had just become the central figure in a negotiation that would determine the fate of two peoples. Everything she had ever known, everyone she had ever loved, every plan she had made for her future, all of it now depended on a decision that would be made by men who saw her not as a person with her own thoughts and desires, but as a valuable piece in a deadly game of diplomacy and survival. But even as fear clawed at her throat, Sarah found herself studying Running Bear's face with new intensity. What she saw there surprised her. This was not the expression of a man who took pleasure in threatening innocent people. This was the look of a leader who had been forced to make impossible choices, someone who understood the weight of what he was demanding, but saw no alternative that would save his people from eventual destruction. For the first time since the negotiations began, Sarah found herself wondering what the world looked like through Comanche eyes. What kind of desperation would drive a proud people to demand such extreme terms for peace? And she found herself wondering if the man who had just claimed her as the price of her people's survival might be someone she could understand if she had the courage to try. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 3 days that followed Sarah's acceptance of her fate passed in a blur of preparation and barely contained panic. Colonel Morgan had agreed to Running Bear's terms with the grim resignation of a commander who understood that some battles could only be won through sacrifice. But Sarah could see the anguish in his eyes every time he looked at her. The entire settlement moved through those final days with the hushed atmosphere of people attending a funeral. Sarah herself had insisted on the arrangement, overriding her father's desperate attempts to find alternative solutions. When Running Bear had made his demand, she had stepped forward before anyone could stop her and spoken words that still echoed in her mind. "I accept your terms, Chief, but I want your word that this arrangement serves peace, not conquest." The Comanche leader had studied her with those penetrating dark eyes for a long moment, before nodding with what might have been respect. "You have courage, Sarah Morgan. Among my people, courage is the most valued trait. You will be treated according to your bravery." Now, as she prepared to leave everything familiar behind, Sarah found herself questioning whether courage or foolishness had motivated her decision. She packed carefully, choosing practical clothing and a few personal items that might provide comfort in whatever ordeal lay ahead. Her father had insisted she take his spare pistol, teaching her to load and fire it properly during their final evening together. "Promise me," he had said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he showed her how to clean the weapon. "Promise me that if things become unbearable, you'll remember that you have options." Sarah had taken the pistol, but refused to make the promise he wanted. Something in Running Bear's manner during their brief interactions had convinced her that honor meant something to him, that his word carried weight even when given to enemies. She was betting her life on that assessment, but it felt like a calculated risk rather than pure desperation. The morning of her departure, Chief Running Bear arrived at dawn with a small escort of warriors and a spare horse equipped with a woman's saddle. The thoughtfulness of that detail surprised many of the settlers who had expected the Comanche to simply throw her across a horse like captured cargo. Instead, Running Bear dismounted and approached Sarah with formal courtesy. "Are you ready?" "Sarah Morgan," he asked, using her full name with careful pronunciation. "As ready as anyone can be for such a journey," she replied, proud that her voice remained steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. He nodded approvingly. "The horse is yours. Her name is Star Walker, and she has carried Comanche women safely across many miles of prairie. She will serve you well if you treat her with respect." Sarah approached the mare cautiously, running her hands along the animal's neck and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Starwalker was a beautiful pinto, clearly chosen for both endurance and gentle temperament. The fact that Running Bear had taken time to select an appropriate mount suggested a level of consideration she hadn't expected. As she settled into the saddle, Sarah looked back at her father and the assembled townspeople one final time. Colonel Morgan stood at rigid attention, every inch the professional soldier, but she could see the tears threatening to spill from his steel-gray eyes. Around him, the faces of neighbors and friends reflected everything from admiration for her sacrifice to horror at what they perceived as her certain doom. "I'll return," she called out, not knowing if she was making a promise she could keep, but needing to offer some hope to the people who had raised her. "This isn't goodbye forever." Running Bear swung back onto his warhorse and gestured for his small party to move out. As they rode through the settlement's gates, Sarah felt the weight of dozens of stares following their progress. She kept her back straight and her head high, determined to show both her own people and her captors that Sarah Morgan would face whatever came next, with dignity intact. The Comanche party moved across the prairie at a steady pace that covered ground efficiently without exhausting the horses. Running Bear rode at the front, his attention divided between scanning the horizon for potential threats and occasionally glancing back to check on their prisoner's condition. The two warriors who flanked Sarah maintained respectful distances while making it clear that escape attempts would be futile. Sarah had expected the journey to be conducted in hostile silence, but as the miles passed, she found herself drawn into careful conversation with her captors. The warrior riding to her left, a man of perhaps 25 with intricate tattoos covering his arms, introduced himself as Swift Arrow and spoke surprisingly good English. "You ride well for a white woman," he observed after they had been traveling for several hours. "Most settlers bounce in the saddle like sacks of grain. My father taught me that a person who can't control their horse is at the mercy of anyone who can," Sarah replied. "On the frontier, that kind of vulnerability gets you killed." Swift Arrow's laugh was genuinely amused. "Your father is wise. Running Bear chose well when he selected you for this arrangement." The comment sparked Sarah's curiosity about the decision-making process that had led to her current situation. "How long had your chief been planning to demand a hostage?" "Since the moon when 3 of our war parties were ambushed by cavalry," Swift Arrow answered after glancing toward Running Bear for permission to continue the conversation. "Our losses were significant." The warriors began talking about abandoning peace negotiations entirely and launching a full war against the settlements. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air that was beginning to cool the prairie. "How many warriors does your chief command?" "Enough," was all Swift Arrow would say, but his tone suggested numbers that would make Cedar Ridge's 43 families seem like a minor obstacle. As they made camp that first evening, Sarah observed the efficiency with which the Comanche warriors handled the practical business of survival on the open plains. Their movements were economical and purposeful, each man understanding his role in establishing security, gathering fuel for a small fire, and preparing the simple meal that would sustain them through the night. Running Bear approached her as she unsaddled Starwalker, his presence commanding even in the growing darkness. "You handle the mare well," he said. "Swift Arrow tells me you have experience with horses." "My father believed that frontier women needed to be as capable as frontier men," Sarah replied, continuing to brush down her mount while they spoke. "I've been riding since I was old enough to stay in a saddle." "Good," Running Bear said with apparent satisfaction. "We have many days of travel ahead, and I prefer companions who can handle the journey without complaint." The word companions caught Sarah's attention. It suggested a relationship more complex than simple captor and prisoner, though she couldn't yet determine what that might mean for her treatment among his people. That night, as she lay wrapped. In blankets beside the small fire, Sarah found herself studying the man who held her fate in his hands. Running Bear sat apart from his warriors, his attention apparently focused on the flames, but his posture suggesting constant awareness of everything happening around them. He was, she realized, a man who never truly relaxed, whose survival and that of his people depended on maintaining perpetual vigilance. "Chief," she said quietly, not wanting to disturb his warriors, but needing to understand something about her situation. "What will be expected of me when we reach your village?" He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "You will be treated as my responsibility," he said, after a moment of consideration. "Your safety and welfare will reflect on my honor as a leader. Beyond that," he paused, as if weighing how much truth she could handle, "much will depend on how well you adapt to our ways, and how my people choose to receive you." It wasn't exactly reassuring, but Sarah appreciated his honesty. "And if I can't adapt, if your people decide they don't want a white woman among them?" Running Bear's smile was barely visible in the darkness, but she could hear it in his voice. "Then you will need to convince them otherwise, Sarah Morgan. You showed courage when you accepted my terms. Now you must show wisdom as well." The second day of travel brought them deeper into Comanche territory, across landscapes that few white settlers had ever seen. Sarah found herself awed by the vastness of the prairie, the endless rolling grasslands that stretched to every horizon like a green ocean beneath the enormous Texas sky. It was beautiful in a way that challenged every assumption she had formed about what constituted civilized country. As they rode, Swift Arrow and the other warrior, who introduced himself as Black Wolf, began teaching her practical skills. She would need to survive among their people. They showed her how to read weather signs in cloud formations, how to identify edible plants that grew wild on the prairie, and how to move quietly through tall grass without leaving obvious trails. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah asked during a rest stop on their second afternoon. "I'm supposed to be your prisoner, not your student." Black Wolf, an older warrior with graying hair and intelligent eyes, considered her question seriously. "Running Bear commanded us to ensure your survival and success among our people," he said finally. "A dead hostage serves no one's interests, and a helpless one becomes a burden that weakens the entire tribe." The practical logic made sense, but Sarah sensed deeper currents in her captor's behavior. These men were treating her with a respect that went beyond simple preservation of valuable property. They were, she realized, genuinely trying to help her succeed in an impossible situation. On the third day, they encountered a Comanche hunting party returning to the main village with fresh buffalo meat. The lead hunter, a fierce-looking warrior, with ritual scars covering half his face, approached Running Bear with obvious deference, but cast hostile glances towards Sarah that made her skin crawl. The conversation between the two men was conducted in rapid Comanche, but Sarah didn't need to understand the words to recognize the tone of disagreement. The scarred warrior's gestures and expressions made his opinion of her presence abundantly clear, while Running Bear's responses carried the quiet authority of a leader who wouldn't tolerate challenges to his decisions. Finally, Running Bear ended the discussion with a sharp gesture that sent the hunting party on their way, but not before the scarred warrior fixed Sarah with a stare that promised future trouble. "Who was that?" Sarah asked Swift Arrow as they resumed their journey. "Iron Hawk," Swift Arrow replied, his tone carefully neutral. "He is influential among the warriors who favor war over diplomacy. He lost 2 brothers in the cavalry ambushes and believes that taking a white hostage shows weakness rather than strength." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach as she realized that her troubles were just beginning. Running Bear might have guaranteed her safety, but that protection would mean nothing if his own people turned against his leadership because of decisions they viewed as misguided. as the sun began to set. On their third day of travel, smoke from cooking fires became visible on the horizon, and Sarah knew that her new life was about to begin. The Comanche village sprawled across a river valley like something from a dream. Hundreds of teepees arranged in family groups, with horse herds grazing nearby and children playing along the water's edge. It was larger than she had expected, clearly, supporting a population that could field the kind of war parties that had terrorized the Texas frontier for decades. But it was also beautiful in a way that challenged every stereotype she had absorbed about savage Indian camps. This was a community, a civilization with its own rules and customs and traditions. As they rode toward the village center, Sarah became aware of the dozens of eyes tracking their progress. Women stopped their work to stare at the white woman, riding beside their war chief. Children ran alongside their horses, chattering excitedly in Comanche while pointing at her pale skin and strange clothing. Warriors emerged from teepees to assess this unprecedented addition to their community. Running Bear guided them to a large teepee near the center of the village, its painted designs marking it as the dwelling of someone important. As he dismounted, an elderly woman emerged from the structure, her weathered face showing no emotion as she studied Sarah with penetrating dark eyes. "Grandmother," Running Bear said in English, clearly for Sarah's benefit, "this is Sarah Morgan, who has come to live among us as surety for the white man's peace treaty. Sarah, this is Wise Woman, my grandmother and the keeper of our family's honor." The elderly woman approached Sarah's horse and looked up at her with an expression that revealed nothing about her thoughts or intentions. When she finally spoke, her English was careful but clear. "So, white girl, you think you can live as Comanche? You think your soft hands and pale skin can survive what our women face every day?" Sarah met the old woman's stare directly, sensing that this moment would determine much about her future treatment. "I think I can learn, grandmother, if someone is willing to teach me." Wise Woman's face remained impassive for several heartbeats before she nodded slightly. "We shall see, Sarah Morgan. We shall see if you have the strength to become something more than you were born to be." Sarah's first week among the Comanche tested every assumption she had ever held about survival, dignity, and the true meaning of strength. Wise Woman had assigned her a small section of Running Bear's family teepee, separated by painted buffalo hides that provided privacy, while making it clear that her presence was temporary until she proved her worth to the community. The elderly matriarch wasted no time in beginning Sarah's education, rousing her before dawn on her first morning with a sharp poke from a wooden staff. "White girl sleeps while Comanche women work," she announced with obvious disapproval. "First lesson, lazy hands make empty bellies." Sarah stumbled from her bedding to find the camp already bustling with activity. Women were tending cooking fires, preparing food for the day's meals, and organizing the countless tasks that kept a community of nearly 800 people functioning efficiently. Children as young as 5 were helping with age-appropriate chores, their contributions valued and expected rather than merely tolerated. "What would you have me do, grandmother?" Sarah asked, using the respectful title that Running Bear had taught her during their journey. Wise Woman studied her critically, taking in Sarah's impractical dress, soft hands, and pale complexion that already showed signs of sunburn from 3 days of prairie travel. "First, you learn to dress like Comanche woman, not like white flower that wilts in real sun." She produced a bundle of clothing from her personal belongings, a practical buckskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, sturdy moccasins designed for walking on rough ground, and a wide leather belt with attached pouches for carrying essential tools. The outfit was clearly well made and had probably belonged to someone important, making Sarah wonder about the story behind this unexpected generosity. "This belonged to my daughter, Morning Star," Wise Woman explained, as if reading Sarah's thoughts. She died of the spotted sickness 3 winters ago, but her clothes should fit you well enough. She was strong woman, brave woman. We see if you can honor her memory by wearing them properly. Sarah changed into the buckskin outfit immediately, appreciating how much more practical it was than her heavy cotton dress and restrictive undergarments. The soft leather moved with her body instead of fighting against it, and the moccasins felt almost like being barefoot while providing protection from thorns and rocks. When she emerged from the teepee, several Comanche women had gathered to observe. This transformation with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. Wise Woman walked around Sarah slowly, adjusting the fit of the dress and repositioning the belt for better balance. "Better," she pronounced finally. "Now you look less like lost white girl and more like woman who might survive what comes next." The next several hours provided Sarah with a crash course in Comanche domestic life that left her exhausted, frustrated, and deeply humbled. Under Wise Woman's demanding supervision, she learned to build and maintain cooking fires using dried buffalo dung as fuel, to prepare pemmican from dried meat and berries, and to tan animal hides using techniques that required both skill and considerable physical strength. Every task revealed the depth of her ignorance about practical survival skills. When she struggled to kindle a fire using traditional methods, a group of Comanche children gathered to watch with obvious amusement as the grown white woman failed at something they had mastered by age 7. When she burned the first batch of corn cakes she attempted to cook, Wise Woman shook her head with theatrical disappointment. "White women know nothing useful," she announced, loudly enough for nearby families to hear. "They sit in wooden houses and let men do all real work. How do they survive when houses burn and men die?" The comment stung because Sarah recognized the truth in it. Her frontier upbringing had taught her to ride, shoot, and manage basic household tasks, but she had never learned the comprehensive survival skills that Comanche women mastered as a matter of course. These women could provide food, shelter, and clothing for their families using nothing but what the prairie provided, skills that made them genuinely independent in ways Sarah had never imagined. But it was the reaction of the Comanche children that really drove home the magnitude of her ignorance. A group of young girls, none older than 12, began teaching her basic techniques with the patient condescension usually reserved for particularly slow toddlers. They showed her how to weave grass into watertight baskets, how to identify edible roots by their leaves and stems, and how to preserve meat using salt and smoke in combinations that would keep food fresh for months. "White lady very slow learner," observed 8-year-old Brightfeather, whose tiny hands could weave complex patterns that Sarah couldn't even follow with her eyes. "Maybe white brain too small for Comanche skills." The other children giggled at this assessment, but their laughter wasn't entirely unkind. Sarah realized that they were treating her like a foreign cousin who needed to learn family traditions, not like an enemy who deserved punishment. It was a distinction that mattered more than she had initially understood. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice patterns in Comanche society that challenged many of her preconceptions about Indian life. Women held positions of real authority, particularly in domestic matters, and their opinions were sought and respected by the men. Decisions affecting the entire community were made through complex discussions involving multiple family groups, with consensus being valued over individual authority. Most surprisingly, children were treated as individuals with rights and opinions, rather than property to be controlled by adults. Young people were expected to contribute according to their abilities, but they were also encouraged to develop their own interests and talents. Sarah watched 12-year-old boys learning to make arrows with the same attention to detail that girls applied to beadwork, and she saw teenagers of both sexes participating in community discussions with voices that were clearly heard and considered. It was Running Bear's 5-year-old nephew, Little Wolf, who provided Sarah with her first real breakthrough in understanding Comanche culture. The boy had been watching her struggles with obvious fascination, and on her 4th morning in the village, he approached with a proposition. "White Aunt Sarah," he said in careful English, "you teach Little Wolf white man's writing marks, and Little Wolf teach you Comanche words. Good trade." Sarah looked down at this serious small boy and felt her heart constrict with unexpected affection. "That sounds like an excellent trade, Little Wolf, but why do you want to learn white man's writing?" "Uncle Running Bear says white men make powerful magic with marks on paper," the child replied with absolute solemnity. "They send messages across many days of travel, and they remember important things for many winters. Little Wolf wants to understand this magic." Their informal education exchange began that afternoon and quickly expanded to include other curious children and even some adults who pretended to be working nearby while actually listening to Sarah's lessons. She taught them the alphabet using charcoal on flat pieces of bark, showing them how letters combined to form words and how words could preserve ideas across time and distance. In exchange, Little Wolf and his friends taught her Comanche vocabulary with the ruthless efficiency that only children could provide. They corrected her pronunciation without mercy, laughed at her grammatical mistakes, and rewarded her progress with the kind of genuine enthusiasm that made her determination to succeed stronger than her embarrassment at frequent failures. But it was her evening conversations with Running Bear that provided Sarah with the deepest insights into the culture she was trying to understand. The war chief made it his practice to check on her progress each night, and their discussions gradually evolved from formal status reports to genuine exchanges of ideas and perspectives. "Your people value individual achievement above community welfare," he observed one evening as they sat beside the cooking fire outside his family's teepee. "This makes you strong in some ways, but weak in others." Sarah considered this assessment carefully. "How do you mean?" "A white man will work very hard to make himself rich or powerful, even if his success brings hardship to his neighbors," Running Bear explained. "A Comanche warrior will share his last piece of meat with a hungry child, even if it means he goes to sleep with an empty belly. Which way creates a stronger people?" The question challenged Sarah to think about community and responsibility in ways she had never considered. But individual achievement also drives progress and innovation. "My father's military success protects his entire settlement, not just his own family." "True," Running Bear acknowledged. "And this is why peace between our peoples might be possible. We have different strengths that could benefit everyone if we can learn to respect rather than destroy each other." These philosophical discussions were interrupted on Sarah's 8th night in the village by a commotion that brought every warrior to full alertness. A scout rode in with news that a cavalry patrol had been spotted less than a day's ride from the village, apparently tracking the trail left by Running Bear's party during their return from the treaty negotiations. The implications were immediately clear to everyone in the camp. If American soldiers attacked the village while Sarah was present, her status as a hostage would become meaningless. She would either die in the fighting or be rescued in a way that would make future peace negotiations impossible. Iron Hawk, the scarred warrior who had opposed Sarah's presence from the beginning, saw this development as vindication of his warnings about trusting white people. He approached Running Bear's fire with a group of supporters, his intentions clear from his aggressive posture and the weapons they carried. "The white girl has brought soldiers to destroy us," he announced loudly enough for most of the camp to hear. "Her people have broken their word before the moon has completed one full cycle. She must die before she can signal our location to her cavalry friends." Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as she realized that Iron Hawk's logic was sound from a Comanche perspective. Her continued presence among them represented an unacceptable risk, and tribal survival demanded practical solutions rather than sentimental attachments to abstract concepts like honor or fair treatment. But Running Bear stepped between Ironhawk and Sarah with calm authority, his hand resting meaningfully on his knife handle. "The woman is under my protection, Ironhawk. She has given no signals and made no attempts to escape. The cavalry patrol proves nothing except that white soldiers are better trackers than we hoped. They follow her trail, like wolves following." "Your blood scent," Ironhawk replied, his voice rising with anger. "Every moment she lives puts our children in danger. I will not let sentiment prevent us from protecting our people." The confrontation was drawing attention from throughout the village, with families emerging from their teepees to watch the two war leaders face off over a decision that could determine the fate of their entire community. Sarah realized that her life hung in the balance of this argument, but more importantly, she understood that the future of peace between the two peoples depended on how this crisis was resolved. "Running Bear," she said quietly, stepping forward despite the obvious danger. "Ironhawk speaks truth about the risk I represent, but killing me won't make the cavalry patrol disappear, and it will give them the excuse they need to attack this village with the full support of the territorial government." Both warriors turned to look at her with surprise, clearly not expecting their prisoner to inject herself into a discussion that would determine her fate. "If the soldiers are truly following our trail," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength, as she thought through the implications of the situation, "then we need to mislead them, not eliminate evidence they've already found. I have an idea that might save both your people and the peace treaty, but it will require all of us to take considerable risks." Ironhawk's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. "The white woman thinks she can solve problems that Comanche warriors cannot handle? This proves her mind has been weakened by fear." But Running Bear was studying Sarah's face with the intense attention he usually reserved for tracking dangerous game. "What do you propose, Sarah Morgan?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save her life or seal her doom. "We make the cavalry patrol believe that I escaped and that you're pursuing me. You can follow me at a safe distance while I lead them away from the village. When we're far enough away that your people are safe, you can recapture me, and we'll return with a story about my failed escape attempt." The audacity of her proposal left both men speechless for several heartbeats. Sarah was essentially volunteering to risk her life in a complex deception that required perfect timing and considerable luck to succeed. "And what prevents you from actually escaping when you have the chance?" Ironhawk demanded. "What white woman would return voluntarily to captivity among savages?" Sarah met his hostile stare directly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "A woman who understands that peace is more valuable than individual freedom, and that honor means keeping your word even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted." Her answer silenced even Ironhawk's objections, and Sarah saw something shift in Running Bear's expression as he realized that this white woman might be someone worthy of the respect he had been according to her. The pre-dawn darkness that shrouded the Comanche village on Sarah's 9th morning among the tribe carried a tension that seemed to make the very air vibrate with anticipation. Running Bear's acceptance of her dangerous plan had transformed what could have been her execution into the most critical test of trust between two peoples who had spent decades viewing each other as mortal enemies. Sarah crouched beside the dying embers of the cooking fire, applying war paint to her face and arms under Wise Woman's expert guidance. The elderly matriarch worked with practiced efficiency, using a mixture of clay, charcoal, and plant dyes to create patterns that would make Sarah appear to have been living wild on the prairie for several days. "You understand what you risk, white granddaughter?" Wise Woman asked quietly, using an endearment that surprised Sarah with its warmth. If cavalry soldiers decide you are truly Comanche woman now, they may shoot first and ask questions later. Sarah met the old woman's eyes. In the dim firelight, seeing genuine concern mixed with something that might have been pride. I understand, grandmother. But if we don't try this, Iron Hawk will kill me anyway, and your people will face cavalry attack within hours. At least this way, we have a chance to save everyone. Wise Woman nodded approvingly as she added the final touches to Sarah's disguise. The transformation was remarkable. The proper clothing, darkened skin, and strategic application of dirt and grass stains had turned the pale frontier woman into someone who could pass for a Comanche captive who had been living rough for days. Remember, Running Bear said as he checked the supplies in her saddlebags one final time, you must convince the cavalry commander that you escaped 3 days ago and have been evading pursuit ever since. Your story must explain why you are alone, why you are moving away from the village, and why I am following you with only 2 warriors instead of a full war party. Sarah rehearsed the cover story they had developed together. She would claim that she had escaped during a buffalo hunt when most of the warriors were away from the village. She had stolen a horse and supplies, but her lack of experience with prairie navigation had caused her to become lost. The Comanche had been tracking her, but cautiously, because Running Bear wanted to recapture her alive to preserve the treaty agreement. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but it required split-second timing and perfect performances from everyone involved. Sarah would leave the village openly, riding hard toward the southeast, where scouts had last spotted the cavalry patrol. Running Bear, Swift Arrow, and Black Wolf would follow at a distance that kept them out of sight, but close enough to intervene. If the deception went wrong, what if the cavalry commander doesn't believe my story? Sarah asked as she mounted Starwalker for what might be her final ride. Then we fight, Running Bear replied, with the calm certainty of a man who had accepted all possible outcomes. But I believe your plan will work, Sarah Morgan. You understand both worlds well enough to build a bridge between them. As Sarah rode out of the village in the grey light of early dawn, she was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes watching her departure. Children peered from behind their mothers' skirts. Warriors stood silent and alert outside their teepees, and elders gathered in small groups to discuss this unprecedented gamble with a white woman's life and their community's future. Little Wolf broke away from his family and ran alongside her horse for several yards, his small hand touching her stirrup in a gesture of farewell that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. "White Aunt Sarah come back safe," he called out in his careful English. "Little Wolf still has much to learn about magic marks." The responsibility she felt toward that bright, curious child and all the others like him strengthened Sarah's resolve as she pushed Starwalker into a sustained gallop across the rolling prairie. Behind her, the Comanche village disappeared into the landscape as if it had never existed, hidden by careful positioning and natural camouflage that would make it nearly invisible to searching cavalry. The September sun climbed higher as Sarah maintained her punishing pace, following game trails and creek beds that would provide the kind of route a desperate escapee might choose. She paused periodically to study her back trail, occasionally spotting distant figures that she knew were Running Bear and his companions maintaining their careful surveillance. By midday, the physical demands of sustained riding were beginning to take their toll. Sarah's thighs ached from gripping the saddle, her shoulders burned from maintaining control of the reins, and her throat felt raw from breathing the dust kicked up by Starwalker's hooves. But she pushed onward, knowing that her performance had to be convincing enough to fool experienced cavalry officers who understood both Comanche tactics and the condition of genuine escapees. It was late afternoon when she spotted the dust cloud that marked the approaching patrol. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she counted the riders, at least 20 men, all armed and moving with the purposeful formation of soldiers expecting trouble. At their head rode an officer whose bearing and uniform marked him as someone with considerable frontier experience. Sarah guided Starwalker to the top of a low ridge where she would be visible to the approaching cavalry, then began waving her arms and calling out in English. The response was immediate. The patrol's formation shifted from cautious advance to rescue mode as they spotted what appeared to be a distressed white woman alone on the prairie. "Help! Please help me!" Sarah called out, allowing genuine exhaustion and fear to color her voice. "I escaped from the Comanche, but they're still following me." The cavalry commander, a weathered man in his 40s with captain's bars on his collar, spurred his horse ahead of his men and approached Sarah with drawn pistol. His eyes took in every detail of her appearance, the Comanche clothing, the war paint, the obvious signs of hard riding and exposure to the elements. "Ma'am, I'm Captain William Hayes, United States Cavalry," he announced formally. "Are you Sarah Morgan, daughter of Colonel James Morgan?" "Yes, thank God you found me," Sarah replied, slumping forward in her saddle with theatrical relief. "I've been riding for 3 days, trying to get back to the settlements. The Comanche war chief took me as payment for a peace treaty, but I managed to escape during a buffalo hunt." Captain Hayes's expression remained carefully neutral as he continued his assessment. "You're a long way from Cedar Ridge, Miss Morgan. What direction did you come from?" Sarah pointed toward the northwest, away from the actual location of the village. "I think it was that way, but I got lost in all this empty country. Everything looks the same out here." "And the Comanche, are they still pursuing you?" "I've seen riders in the distance," Sarah said, allowing her voice to tremble slightly. "I think it's Chief Running Bear and some of his warriors. They want me back alive because I'm supposed to guarantee the peace treaty." Captain Hayes studied the horizon carefully, his experienced eyes searching for signs of hostile Indians. "Sergeant Morrison," he called to one of his men, "send scouts to check our flanks and rear. If there are Comanche in the area, I want to know about it." As the cavalry patrol reorganized to provide protection for their rescued prisoner, Sarah felt the weight of her deceptions settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. These men were risking their lives based on lies she was telling them, and their trust made her feel like a traitor to her own people. But the alternative, a bloody confrontation that would destroy any chance of peace between the two cultures, was far worse than the guilt of misleading well-intentioned soldiers. "Miss Morgan," Captain Hayes said as he offered her water from his canteen, "I need to understand the current situation with the Comanche. Has Chief Running Bear honored the terms of the treaty so far?" The question was exactly what Sarah had been hoping for, an opportunity to reinforce the peace agreement while maintaining her cover story. "He kept his word about my treatment, Captain. I wasn't harmed or mistreated, just held as guarantee that the settlers would honor their promises. If I hadn't escaped, I think the arrangement might have actually worked." Captain Hayes raised an eyebrow at this assessment. "You're suggesting that the Comanche were negotiating in good faith?" "I think Chief Running Bear genuinely wants peace," Sarah replied carefully. "His people have suffered heavy losses in recent fighting, and he knows that full-scale war would be devastating for both sides. The hostage arrangement was supposed to ensure that neither side could break the treaty without serious consequences. It was a dangerous line to walk, defending Comanche motivations while maintaining the fiction that she had escaped against their will. But Sarah could see that her words were having the desired effect. Captain Hayes was a professional soldier who understood the strategic realities of frontier warfare, and the possibility of genuine peace would appeal to his practical nature. The conversation was interrupted by the return of one of the scouts, who approached at a gallop with news that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Captain, we've got Comanche sign all around us." the young soldier reported breathlessly. At least 3 riders, maybe more, staying just out of rifle range, but definitely tracking our movement. Captain Hayes's hand moved instinctively to his. Sabre, as he processed this information. How long have they been following us, Corporal? Hard to say, sir, but the tracks suggest they've been paralleling our course for several hours. Could be they were already tracking Miss Morgan when we found her. Sarah forced herself to look frightened rather than relieved. Running Bear was maintaining his part of the deception perfectly, staying close enough to be detected, but far enough away to avoid immediate confrontation. Captain, Sarah said urgently, if Chief Running Bear is out there, he won't attack as long as I'm with you. He needs me alive to preserve the treaty. But if shooting starts, a lot of good men on both sides are going to die for nothing. Hayes studied her face intently, clearly trying to assess whether she was giving him valuable intelligence or attempting some form of manipulation. What do you suggest, Miss Morgan? This was the crucial moment, the point where Sarah's plan would either succeed or collapse catastrophically. Let me try to talk to him, Captain. If I can convince Running Bear that I escaped fairly and that pursuing me further would violate the treaty terms, he might withdraw and let you escort me back to the settlements. The suggestion was audacious enough to give Captain Hayes pause. Miss Morgan, you're asking me to allow a rescued hostage to voluntarily approach hostile Indians. My orders are to return you safely to your father, not to risk your life in amateur diplomacy. But if we can resolve this without bloodshed, both sides benefit, Sarah argued. Chief Running Bear is a reasonable man who honors his commitments. If he agrees to let me go in exchange for continued adherence to the treaty terms, it proves that peace is possible. Captain Hayes was clearly torn between his military instincts and the larger implications of the situation. After several minutes of tense consideration, he nodded grimly. Very well, Miss Morgan, but we do this with maximum precautions. My men will be positioned to provide covering fire, and at the first sign of treachery, we retreat with you, whether you like it or not. Sarah's heart soared with relief, though she was careful not to let her emotions show. The most dangerous part of her plan was about to begin, but at least she had convinced the cavalry commander to give diplomacy a chance. As the patrol took defensive positions on high ground, Sarah rode forward alone toward the distant figures that she knew were Running Bear and his companions. The next few minutes would determine whether her desperate gamble would save both peoples from a war that neither could truly win. The 3 Comanche warriors approached slowly, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. Running Bear rode slightly ahead of Swift Arrow and Black Wolf, his bearing dignified and calm despite the obvious tension of the situation. When they were close enough for conversation, Running Bear called out in English loud enough for the cavalry to hear. Sarah Morgan, you have brought soldiers to Comanche lands. This breaks the agreement between our peoples. Sarah's response had to be perfect, convincing to both audiences while advancing the cause of peace. Chief Running Bear, I escaped fairly during the buffalo hunt. You agreed to treat me with honor, and honor allows a captive to seek freedom when the opportunity presents itself. And now you hide behind cavalry guns, Running Bear replied, his voice carrying exactly the right note of controlled anger. This is not the action of a woman who respects Comanche ways. I respect Comanche ways enough to propose a solution that serves both our peoples, Sarah said, raising her voice so Captain Hayes could hear every word. The peace treaty remains in effect. I have been treated honorably during my time among your people, and now I return to mine as agreed. Let this be proof that Comanche and white man can coexist with mutual respect. The theatrical dialogue continued for several more exchanges, with both Sarah and Running Bear playing their roles perfectly. To the watching cavalry, it appeared that a brave woman was successfully negotiating her own release from captivity. To anyone who understood the deeper currents of the conversation, It was clear that both sides were working to preserve a peace agreement that served their mutual interests. Finally, Running Bear raised his hand in a gesture that combined farewell, with formal acknowledgement of terms agreed upon. "Go in peace, Sarah Morgan. The Comanche will remember that you showed courage and honor during your time among us. May your people prove equally honorable in keeping their promises." As the three warriors turned and rode away, disappearing into the vast prairie with the fluid grace that made Comanche horsemen legendary, Sarah felt a profound sense of loss mixed with triumph. She had successfully preserved the peace treaty and saved countless lives, but the cost was higher than she had anticipated. She was returning to her old life, but she was no longer the same person who had left Cedar Ridge 9 days earlier. The experience of living among the Comanche had changed her in fundamental ways, giving her perspectives and loyalties that would make it impossible to simply resume her former existence. Captain Hayes approached with obvious relief and professional admiration. "Miss Morgan, that was either the bravest or the most foolhardy thing I've ever witnessed. How did you know that Comanche chief would honor such an arrangement?" Sarah looked back toward the horizon, where Running Bear and his companions had vanished, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she might never see them again. "Because, Captain, I learned that honor and courage aren't the exclusive property of any single people. They exist wherever good people choose to practice them, regardless of the color of their skin or the culture they were born into." As the cavalry patrol began the journey back to Cedar Ridge, Sarah carried with her secrets that could never be shared, and an understanding of both worlds that would shape the rest of her life. The deception had succeeded, but its success had created new challenges that would test her resolve in ways she was only beginning to understand. Sarah's return to Cedar Ridge 3 days later should have been a moment of triumph and celebration, but instead it felt like a funeral procession through a community that no longer recognized the woman who had left them less than 2 weeks earlier. The settlement gates opened to admit Captain Hayes's patrol and their rescued hostage, but the cheers and tears of relief that greeted her felt hollow against the weight of secrets she could never share. Colonel Morgan stood waiting in the settlement's central square, his weathered face showing every hour of worry and sleepless nights he had endured since watching his daughter ride away with Comanche warriors. When Sarah dismounted from Starwalker, a detail that several observant settlers noted with surprise, her father's embrace was fierce enough to crack her ribs. "Sarah, thank God you're safe," he whispered against her hair, his voice breaking. With emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "When we heard the cavalry had found you, I hardly dared to believe it was true." But even as she returned her father's embrace, Sarah was acutely aware of how the simple gesture highlighted the fundamental changes in her perspective. The Comanche didn't express affection through such physical demonstrations, instead showing care through actions, shared responsibilities, and quiet support during difficult times. Her father's emotional display, while genuine and deeply appreciated, felt almost foreign after 9 days of living according to different cultural norms. The settlers who gathered around them peppered Sarah with questions about her captivity, her treatment among the Comanche, and the details of her dramatic escape. Their curiosity was natural and well-intentioned, but every question forced her to elaborate on the deception that had preserved the peace treaty, while putting her in the uncomfortable position of reinforcing negative stereotypes about people she had come to respect and care about. "Were you mistreated, Miss Sarah?" asked Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, whose own daughter was close to Sarah's age. "We've heard such terrible stories about what happens to white women taken by Indians." Sarah forced herself to look appropriately grateful for the concern, while carefully crafting her response. "Chief Running Bear kept his word about treating me with dignity," she said, choosing her words to be truthful while supporting the fiction of her escape. "I was never harmed or compromised, but living among them showed me how different our worlds really are. Different how? Pressed young Tom Wilson, whose father served as the settlement's blacksmith. Are they really as savage as the newspapers claim? The question struck at the heart of Sarah's internal conflict. Everything she had experienced among the Comanche contradicted the popular narrative of mindless savagery and barbaric behavior. She had seen a complex society with its own forms of justice, education, and social responsibility. She had witnessed acts of kindness, wisdom, and genuine nobility that challenged every assumption her own people held about Indian character. But admitting this truth would undermine the very stereotypes that made her escape story believable, and would raise questions about why she had chosen to return to a supposedly inferior way of life. They have their own customs and beliefs, Sarah replied diplomatically. Some practices that seem strange to us, others that any civilized person could respect. Chief Running Bear is an intelligent man who genuinely wants peace between our peoples. Captain Hayes, who had been silent during these exchanges, stepped forward with professional authority. Colonel Morgan, I need to brief you on the strategic situation we observed during Miss Sarah's rescue. The Comanche are clearly organized and well-armed, but they also appear genuinely committed to honoring the peace treaty as long as we do the same. This assessment opened a discussion about military preparations, trade arrangements, and the long-term prospects for maintaining peaceful relations with the Comanche nation. Sarah listened with growing appreciation for Captain Hayes's balanced perspective, recognizing that his military experience had given him insights that many civilians lacked. The chief seemed willing to let Miss Sarah go rather than risk breaking the treaty, Hayes continued. That suggests a level of strategic thinking that goes beyond simple warrior culture. We may be dealing with a leader who understands that peace serves his people's interests better than continued warfare. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward the cavalry officer for presenting Running Bear in terms that emphasized his intelligence and leadership qualities rather than simply portraying him as a defeated enemy. It was a perspective that might help bridge the gap between the two communities, if enough people were willing to listen. Over the following days, Sarah found herself struggling to readjust to life in Cedar Ridge while carrying the weight of her divided loyalties. The physical comforts of civilization, regular meals, a real bed, protection from the elements were undeniably pleasant after the rigorous demands of Comanche life. But she missed the sense of purpose and community integration that had characterized her time among Running Bear's people. In the Comanche village, every person had clearly defined roles that contributed to the survival and prosperity of the entire community. Children learned essential skills through meaningful participation in daily activities rather than through abstract lessons disconnected from practical application. Adults made decisions through consensus-building processes that valued wisdom and experience over formal authority. Cedar Ridge, by contrast, felt constrained by artificial social hierarchies and gender restrictions that limited individual potential while serving no obvious practical purpose. Sarah found herself chafing against expectations that she resume her pre-captivity role as the colonel's unmarried daughter, waiting passively for some suitable man to offer marriage while contributing nothing more significant to community welfare than occasional charitable activities and social visits. The contrast became particularly apparent during her first Sunday back in the settlement, when Pastor Williams used his sermon to thank God for Sarah's deliverance from heathen captivity and to remind the congregation of their Christian duty to resist the moral corruption represented by Indian influence. Our sister Sarah has been returned to us as proof of God's protection over the righteous, the pastor proclaimed from his makeshift pulpit. But let us not forget that she was exposed to practices and beliefs that could easily lead a weaker soul astray. We must surround her with Christian love and proper guidance to ensure that no trace of savage influence takes root in her heart. Sarah sat in the front pew beside her father, listening to herself being discussed as if she were a piece of property that had been temporarily contaminated by contact with inferior people. The pastor's words revealed assumptions about Comanche culture that were not only wrong but dangerously prejudiced, the kind of thinking that made future conflicts almost inevitable. After the service, she found herself surrounded by well-meaning church members who offered advice about recovering from her ordeal and returning to proper Christian life. Their suggestions ranged from extended periods of prayer and fasting to immediate marriage as a way of establishing her respectability and providing male protection against future difficulties. "Sarah, dear," said Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife and self-appointed social coordinator for the settlement's unmarried women, "you must put this terrible experience behind you and focus on finding a suitable husband. There are several fine young men who would be honored to court the colonel's daughter, despite what you've been through." The phrase, "despite what you've been through," revealed the underlying assumption that Sarah had been somehow damaged or diminished by her contact with Comanche culture. It was an attitude that made her want to scream with frustration, but she forced herself to respond with appropriate gratitude for the offered concern. "I appreciate your kindness, Mrs. Pemberton, but I need time to process what happened before I make any decisions about my future." It was a response that satisfied no one while committing her to nothing, a diplomatic approach she had learned from watching Running Bear navigate complex tribal politics during her time in his village. But her real struggle wasn't with the social expectations of Cedar Ridge society. It was with the growing realization that she could never be satisfied with the limited horizons that frontier life offered to women. Her experience among the Comanche had shown her possibilities for meaningful contribution and personal agency that simply didn't exist within the constraints of white settlement culture. The crisis came to a head 2 weeks after her return, when a messenger arrived from the territorial capital with news that would force Sarah to choose between the two worlds she had come to understand so well. Governor Henderson had learned of the successful peace negotiations with the Comanche and wanted to expand the treaty to include other tribes in the region. He was requesting that Colonel Morgan serve as his special representative for these expanded negotiations, with the understanding that Sarah's unique experience as a Comanche hostage might provide valuable insights into Indian thinking and motivation. The proposal represented an unprecedented opportunity for a woman to influence territorial policy on Indian affairs, but accepting it would require Sarah to reveal knowledge and perspectives that could only have come from genuine integration into Comanche society rather than simple captivity. "Sarah," her father said, as they discussed the governor's offer in the privacy of their cabin, "this could be your chance to do something genuinely important for both our people and the Comanche. Your insights into their culture and motivations could prevent years of bloodshed." Colonel Morgan had always been more progressive than most frontier men in his attitudes toward women's capabilities, but even he was struggling with the implications of what the governor was proposing. "However, I need to know that you're prepared for the scrutiny this role would bring. People will ask detailed questions about your time among the Indians, and your answers will be examined for any sign that you've been influenced by their perspectives." Sarah understood exactly what her father was asking. Could she maintain her cover story while providing useful insights? Could she advocate for fair treatment of the Comanche without revealing her genuine admiration for their culture? Could she serve as a bridge between the two worlds without falling into the gap between them? "Father," she said after a long moment of consideration, "I learned things during my captivity that could help prevent future wars and save lives on both sides." If the governor believes my experience can serve the cause of peace, then I think I have an obligation to try. It was a commitment that would transform Sarah from a passive victim of circumstances into an active agent of change. But it also meant accepting risks that went far beyond simple physical danger. She would be walking a diplomatic tightrope between two peoples who still viewed each other with suspicion and hostility, knowing that a single misstep could destroy everything she was trying to build. That night, as she lay in her comfortable bed listening to the familiar sounds of the settlement settling down for the night, Sarah found herself thinking about little Wolf and wondering if he was still practicing the writing lessons she had taught him. She thought about Wise Woman's patient instruction in practical survival skills and Running Bear's philosophical discussions about leadership and responsibility. Most of all, she thought about the choice she was about to make, a choice that would define not only her own future, but potentially the relationship between two peoples who desperately needed to find common ground. The morning brought a messenger from Running Bear himself, a young warrior who arrived under a white flag carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. Inside, Sarah found an intricately beaded medicine bag and a note written in careful English, using the alphabet she had taught to the children. For the bridge walker who chose honor over safety, the path between worlds is dangerous but necessary. Walk carefully but walk forward. Your Comanche family remembers. The gift confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect, that Running Bear understood exactly what she was doing and why. More importantly, it suggested that he was prepared to support her efforts to build lasting peace between their peoples, even if it required continued deception and considerable personal risk for both of them. As she fastened the medicine bag around her neck, hidden beneath her dress, where no one in Cedar Ridge would see it, Sarah felt the weight of her dual identity settling on her shoulders like a mantle of responsibility. She was no longer simply Sarah Morgan, the colonel's daughter who had survived Comanche captivity. She was becoming something new and unprecedented, a woman who belonged fully to neither world but was uniquely qualified to serve both. The real test of her resolve was about to begin. 3 months after her return to Cedar Ridge, Sarah found herself sitting in the most important diplomatic gathering in Texas territorial history, surrounded by representatives of 7 different Indian tribes and a dozen white officials who held the power to shape the future of the entire region. The Great Council, as Governor Henderson had grandly named it, was taking place in San Antonio under the auspices of the territorial government, with the ambitious goal of establishing a comprehensive peace treaty that would end decades of warfare. On the Texas frontier, Sarah's role as cultural advisor had evolved far beyond what anyone had initially envisioned. Her insights into Comanche thinking and tribal politics had proven so valuable during the preliminary negotiations that Governor Henderson had essentially made her his primary consultant on all matters relating to Indian affairs. It was an unprecedented position for a woman in territorial government, but the governor was practical enough to recognize expertise regardless of its source. "Miss Morgan," Governor Henderson said as they prepared for the day's session, "the Kiowa delegation arrived this morning, and their chief has specifically requested to speak with you. Apparently, word of your experience among the Comanche has spread throughout the tribal networks, and they're curious about a white woman who understands Indian ways." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and anxiety at this news. Each successful interaction with tribal representatives strengthened her position as a bridge between the two cultures, but it also increased the risk that someone would see through the carefully constructed story of her captivity and escape. The deception that had saved lives was becoming increasingly complex as more people became involved in the peace process. The council meetings were held in the largest building San Antonio could provide, a converted warehouse that had been hastily furnished with benches, tables, and the territorial flag to give it some semblance of official dignity. Representatives from the Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Tonkawa, Caddo, Wichita, and Cherokee nations sat in careful formations that reflected both traditional alliances and current political realities. At the head of the Comanche delegation sat Running Bear himself, his presence commanding respect from both Indian and white participants. He had arrived 2 days earlier with a small escort of senior warriors, and his interactions with territorial officials had been models of diplomatic courtesy combined with unmistakable strength. To the watching white observers, he appeared to be exactly what they expected from a successful war chief: intelligent, formidable, and committed to protecting his people's interests. Only Sarah could see the subtle signs that revealed his awareness of her presence and his appreciation for the delicate game they were both playing. A slight nod when their eyes met across the crowded room, a careful choice of words that supported her credibility without appearing to do so, a positioning of his delegation that made informal conversation possible during breaks in the formal proceedings. Chief Running Bear, Governor Henderson said as the morning session began, "We're grateful for your continued commitment to the peace process. The territorial government recognizes the Comanche as a sovereign nation with legitimate claims to ancestral lands, and we hope to establish arrangements that serve both our people's interests." Running Bear's response was delivered in English that had improved markedly since their first meeting at Cedar Ridge, another detail that only Sarah fully appreciated. "Governor Henderson, the Comanche seek peace that brings honor to all parties. We have learned that some white leaders speak truth and keep promises. We hope this council will prove that such leaders represent more than individual exceptions." The carefully diplomatic language concealed barbed references to the long history of broken treaties and betrayed trust that characterized white Indian relations throughout Texas. But it also offered hope that past failures could be overcome through genuine commitment to fair dealing. The Kiowa chief, Striking Eagle, was a man in his 50s whose scarred face and missing left hand testified to decades of warfare. When he rose to address the council, his words carried the weight of someone who had seen too much conflict and understood its true costs. "I have fought white soldiers for more years than some of you have been alive," he said, his English accented but clear. "I have lost sons, brothers, and friends to cavalry bullets and settler diseases, but I have also learned that war brings suffering to all people, regardless of the color of their skin." He turned to look directly at Sarah, his dark eyes studying her with intense curiosity. "I am told there is a white woman here who lived among the Comanche and learned their ways. I would hear her speak about what she discovered during this time." Sarah felt every eye in the room focus on her as she rose to respond. This was the moment she had been preparing for since accepting the governor's appointment, the test of whether she could provide valuable insights while maintaining the fiction that had made the peace possible. "Chief Striking Eagle," she began, her voice steady despite the importance of the moment, "my time among the Comanche taught me that courage, honor, and love of family are not the exclusive property of any single people. I saw Comanche mothers caring for their children with the same devotion as any white woman, and Comanche warriors showing the same loyalty to their people as any American soldier shows to his flag." A murmur ran through the assembled delegates as they processed this assessment. For many of the white officials, it was the first time they had heard Indian character described in terms that emphasized common humanity rather than fundamental differences. "But I also learned," Sarah continued, "that peace requires more than good intentions. It requires understanding, respect, and the willingness to honor agreements even when circumstances make it difficult to do so." Striking Eagle nodded slowly, apparently satisfied with her response. "You speak like someone who has truly seen beyond the surface of things. This gives me hope that this council might achieve more than previous attempts at peacemaking." The endorsement from such a respected war leader significantly enhanced Sarah's credibility with both Indian and white participants. Over the following days, she found herself at the center of countless informal discussions as representatives from different tribes sought her insights into everything from territorial boundaries to trade arrangements. The complexity of the negotiations soon became apparent as each tribe presented their own concerns and requirements for a lasting peace agreement. The Apache delegation, led by a young chief named Red Cloud, demanded guarantees about hunting rights in the Davis Mountains. The Cherokee representatives wanted assurances about their status as an agricultural people who needed permanent settlement. Areas. The Tonkawa, traditional enemies of the Comanche, required specific protections against revenge attacks for their past cooperation with white military forces. Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial translator, not just of languages, but of cultural concepts and motivations that white officials often failed to understand. When the Apache chief spoke about the spiritual significance of certain territorial landmarks, she helped explain why monetary compensation couldn't substitute for access to sacred sites. When Cherokee representatives discussed their agricultural needs, she clarified the differences between their farming practices and white settlement patterns. But it was her work with the Comanche delegation that proved most crucial to the council's ultimate success. During a private meeting with Governor Henderson and his senior advisors, Running Bear presented a proposal that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between his people and the territorial government. "The Comanche have watched white settlement expand across our ancestral lands for many years," he said, his words carefully chosen for maximum diplomatic impact. "We have seen that this expansion will continue regardless of our wishes, but we have also learned that some white leaders are willing to deal fairly with Indian peoples." He paused, allowing the implications of his statement to register before continuing. "We propose a different kind of agreement, not simply a peace treaty that postpones conflict, but a partnership that serves both peoples' long-term interests." The proposal he outlined was revolutionary in its scope and sophistication. Instead of the traditional pattern of Indian tribes being forced onto smaller and smaller reservations, the Comanche would maintain control over vast areas of their traditional territory, while allowing regulated white settlement in designated zones. In exchange, they would provide services that white settlements desperately needed: scouting, guide services, and protection against hostile tribes, while maintaining their own cultural independence. This arrangement, Running Bear explained, allows Comanche people to adapt to changing conditions while preserving what is most important to our identity. White settlers gain access to land and security, while Comanche gain economic opportunities and political recognition. Sarah watched Governor Henderson's face as he processed the implications of what was being proposed. It was far more complex than anything the territorial government had previously considered, but it also offered solutions to problems that had seemed intractable under traditional approaches to Indian relations. "Chief Running Bear," the governor said finally, "you're proposing what amounts to a sovereign nation within territorial boundaries. The legal and political complications would be enormous. All meaningful change involves complications," Running Bear replied with a slight smile. "The question is whether the benefits justify the effort required to overcome them." During the break that followed this exchange, Sarah found herself walking in the small garden behind the meeting hall, trying to process the magnitude of what was being discussed. The partnership proposal could revolutionize Indian-white relations throughout the American frontier, but it also required levels of trust and cooperation that seemed almost impossible given the history of conflict between the two peoples. She was surprised when Running Bear appeared beside her, having left his own delegation to seek this brief moment of private conversation. "You have done well, Sarah Morgan," he said quietly, using English but speaking in the indirect style that characterized important Comanche conversations. "Your words carry weight with both sides, and your understanding helps prevent the misunderstandings that have destroyed previous negotiations." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude mixed with continuing anxiety about the complexity of her position. "Chief, what you proposed in there, it's brilliant, but it's also dangerous. There are people on both sides who will see such cooperation as betrayal of their own people." Running Bear nodded gravely. "All bridges are dangerous to build, but the alternative is remaining forever separated by the river between us. You understand this, or you would not have chosen to walk between worlds as you have done." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Striking Eagle and Red Cloud, who had clearly been seeking this opportunity to speak privately with both Running Bear and Sarah. The older Kiowa chief's expression was serious as he addressed them. "The proposal you presented today, Running Bear, requires trust between peoples who have been enemies for generations," he said. "My warriors ask why they should believe that white promises will be kept this time when so many previous treaties have been broken." It was Sarah who answered, recognizing that this moment required her to reveal more of her true understanding than she had previously risked. "Chief Striking Eagle, trust must be built through actions, not just words. The partnership Chief Running Bear proposes creates mutual dependence. Neither side can betray the other without harming their own interests." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But more than that, it recognizes that both peoples have strengths the other needs. White technology and resources, combined with Indian knowledge and skills, could create something better than either culture could achieve alone." Red Cloud, who had been listening intently, asked the question that went to the heart of everyone's concerns. And what happens when white settlers decide they want all the land, not just the portions assigned to them? What happens when politicians in Washington decide that Indian partnerships are inconvenient? Sarah met his gaze directly, understanding that her answer would influence not just the Apache chief's decision, but the entire trajectory of the negotiations. "Then we make sure that the partnerships are so valuable, so successful, and so visible, that destroying them would be political suicide for anyone who attempted it." The conversation that followed laid the groundwork for what would become known as the Great Alliance, a network of cooperative agreements between multiple tribes and the territorial government that would transform the Texas frontier from a battleground into a model of cross-cultural cooperation. But as Sarah walked back toward the meeting hall, she knew that the most difficult challenges still lay ahead. Building the alliance would require navigating political opposition, cultural prejudices, and the constant risk that her own dual identity would be discovered and used to discredit everything they were trying to accomplish. The assassination attempt came without warning on a crisp November morning, 3 weeks into the Great Council negotiations. Sarah was reviewing treaty documents in her temporary quarters at the San Antonio boarding house when the window beside her desk exploded in a shower of glass and splinters. The rifle bullet that had been intended for her head instead buried itself in the wooden beam directly behind where she had been sitting moments before. Her survival was pure chance. She had bent down to retrieve a dropped pen just as the shot was fired. As she crouched behind the overturned desk, her heart hammering with the realization of how close death had come, Sarah understood that the dangerous game she had been playing for months was about to become far more deadly. Shouts erupted from the street below as territorial marshals and local citizens responded to the gunshot. Through the shattered window, Sarah could see a figure on horseback disappearing around the corner of a distant building, too far away for identification, but clearly someone who had planned this attack carefully. Governor Henderson arrived within minutes, his face grim as he surveyed the damage and the implications of what had just occurred. "Miss Morgan, are you injured?" he asked, helping her to her feet while his security detail secured the area. "I'm unharmed, Governor, but obviously someone wants me dead," Sarah replied, brushing glass fragments from her dress while trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. "The question is whether this was personal opposition to my role in the negotiations or part of a larger effort to sabotage the peace process." The answer came sooner than anyone expected. Marshal Thompson, the senior law enforcement officer, assigned to the council's security, discovered evidence in the abandoned sniper's position that chilled everyone involved in the peace negotiations. Along with the rifle and spent cartridge, he found a crude manifesto that outlined a conspiracy to destroy the Great Alliance before it could be formalized. "Governor," Marshal Thompson reported during an emergency meeting that afternoon, "this wasn't the work of a lone gunman. The document we found describes a coordinated effort involving both white supremacist groups and hostile Indian factions who view the peace negotiations as betrayal of their respective peoples." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach as she realized the full scope of what they were facing. "Are you saying there are people on both sides working together to prevent peace?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Thompson confirmed grimly. "The manifesto mentions specific plans to assassinate key negotiators, stage false flag attacks to blame on the other side, and create incidents that would make continued cooperation impossible." Governor Henderson's expression grew darker with each detail. "Do we have any intelligence about the scope of this conspiracy or the identity of its leaders?" "Some names, sir, but not enough to prevent further attacks. The document mentions a white supremacist leader named Marcus Steele, who's been organizing opposition among settlers who believe any accommodation with Indians represents weakness and betrayal of white interests. On the Indian side, there's reference to a war chief called Bloodhawk, who leads a faction of warriors from multiple tribes who view the peace negotiations as capitulation to white expansion." Sarah recognized the name Bloodhawk from conversations during her time among the Comanche. He was Ironhawk's cousin, a warrior whose hatred of white people had only intensified after losing his entire family in a cavalry raid 2 years earlier. The fact that he was now working with white supremacists to destroy the peace process revealed the complex and disturbing nature of the opposition they faced. "Governor," Sarah said, her mind racing through the implications of this intelligence, "if both sides of this conspiracy are willing to work together to prevent peace, they'll coordinate their attacks for maximum impact. The assassination attempt on me was probably just the beginning." Her prediction proved accurate within hours. As the sun set over San Antonio, a series of coordinated incidents shattered the carefully maintained atmosphere of cooperation that had characterized the Great Council negotiations. First, a group of armed white men attacked a Tonkawa hunting party that had been legally gathering food supplies for their delegation. 2 warriors were killed and 3 others wounded before territorial. Marshals arrived to drive off the attackers. The assault was clearly designed to provoke retaliation and create the kind of cycle of violence that had characterized frontier relations for decades. Simultaneously, a Cherokee family that had been traveling to visit relatives in San Antonio was ambushed by warriors whose tribal affiliation couldn't be immediately determined. The attack resulted in the death of an elderly man and serious injuries to 2 women, creating exactly the kind of incident that would inflame anti-Indian sentiment among white settlers while generating calls for military retaliation. But the most devastating blow came when someone, using inside knowledge of the council's security arrangements, planted explosives in the building where the negotiations were taking place. The bomb was discovered before it could detonate, but the implications were terrifying. Someone with access to detailed information about the Council's operations was actively working to destroy not just the peace process, but potentially dozens of the most important leaders from both cultures. This changes everything, Governor. Henderson announced during an emergency session that included all delegation leaders and senior territorial officials. We're not just dealing with isolated opposition to the peace process. We're facing a coordinated campaign of terrorism designed to make cooperation between our peoples impossible. Running Bear's response was measured, but carried an undercurrent of steel that reminded everyone why he had become the most respected war chief on the southern plains. Governor Henderson speaks truth. These attacks are meant to force us back into the patterns of violence that have brought suffering to all our peoples. The question is whether we have the courage to continue building peace despite those who profit from war. His words sparked immediate discussion among the assembled delegates. Some voices called for suspending the negotiations until the security situation could be resolved. Others argued that yielding to terrorist pressure would only encourage further attacks and make future peace efforts even more difficult. Striking Eagle, the Kiowa chief whose endorsement had been crucial to the Council's credibility, stood to address the assembly with obvious emotion. My people have lost warriors today to cowards who attack from hiding. The Tonkawa have lost brothers to men who claim to speak for white civilization while acting like rabid animals. But we have also seen territorial marshals risk their lives to protect Indian families, and white officials work honestly to address our concerns. He paused, his scarred face reflecting years of painful experience with the complexities of frontier politics. Blood Hawk was once my war leader, a man I trusted with my life. But grief and hatred have poisoned his heart until he can no longer see any path except revenge. I will not let his blindness destroy what we have built here. Sarah found herself standing before she consciously decided to speak, driven by a sudden understanding of what needed to be said. Chiefs, Governor, distinguished delegates, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the tense silence that had fallen over the assembly. The people behind these attacks understand something that we must also understand. This peace process threatens their power and their worldview in fundamental ways. She could see Running Bear watching her intently, his expression unreadable, but his attention completely focused on her words. Marcus Steele and his followers profit from conflict between whites and Indians. Bloodhawk and his warriors derive their identity and status from being at war with white civilization. Peace makes both groups irrelevant, which is why they're willing to work together to destroy it. Governor Henderson leaned forward with obvious interest. What are you suggesting, Miss Morgan? I'm suggesting that we make their cooperation work against them, Sarah replied, the plan forming in her mind even as she spoke. If we can expose the fact that white supremacists and hostile Indians are collaborating to prevent peace, we discredit both groups with their own followers. The audacity of her proposal left the assembly speechless for several moments. Sarah was essentially suggesting that they turn the conspiracy against itself by revealing the very cooperation that made it dangerous. Red Cloud, the Apache chief, whose skeptical questions had initially challenged the entire peace process, was the first to respond. You speak of exposing this alliance, but how do we gather evidence when both sides will deny any cooperation with their supposed enemies? Sarah had been thinking about exactly that problem. We know they're planning more attacks. If we can anticipate their next move and position ourselves to document their coordination, we can create evidence that neither side will be able to deny. Running Bear's voice carried a note of warning when he spoke. Such a plan would require someone to place themselves in great danger, someone who could move between both worlds without arousing suspicion. The implication was clear to everyone in the room, though only Sarah and Running Bear fully understood its deeper meaning. She was the logical choice for such a mission. Her experience with both cultures, her established credibility with tribal leaders, and her known opposition to the conspiracy made her uniquely qualified to gather the evidence they needed. But it would also require her to step far beyond the diplomatic role she had been playing and actively engage in intelligence gathering. That could easily result in her death if discovered. "I'll do it," Sarah said quietly, making a decision that surprised even herself with its finality. "I have contacts among both white settlers and various tribal groups. If anyone can document this conspiracy, it's me." Governor Henderson's immediate response was predictable. "Miss Morgan, I cannot and will not authorize a civilian woman to undertake such a dangerous intelligence mission. The risks are simply too great." "With respect, Governor," Sarah replied, her voice carrying an authority that reflected her growing confidence in her unique position. "This conspiracy threatens everything we've worked to build here. If we don't stop it now, there may never be another chance for peace." She looked around the assembly, meeting the eyes of leaders from both cultures who had come to respect her judgment and insights. "I've already survived one assassination attempt. The people behind these attacks see me as a threat to their goals, which means I'm already a target, whether I actively oppose them or not." Striking Eagle nodded slowly, his weathered face showing grudging admiration for her courage. "The white woman speaks with warrior's heart. Perhaps this is why the spirits brought her to walk between our worlds." The endorsement from such a respected war leader carried enormous weight with both Indian and white delegates. Over the next hour, the assembly debated the risks and potential benefits of Sarah's proposed mission while she worked with territorial intelligence officers to develop a practical plan for gathering the evidence they needed. The strategy they devised was elegant in its simplicity, but terrifying in its requirements. Sarah would use her established connections to make contact with moderate members of both conspiracy factions, positioning herself as someone who was having second thoughts about the peace process and might be willing to provide inside information about the negotiations. If successful, she would be able to document the coordination between white supremacists and hostile Indians, while potentially learning about future attacks in time to prevent them. If discovered, she would almost certainly be killed by people who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence to achieve their goals. As the emergency session concluded and delegates dispersed to inform their respective peoples about the new security measures being implemented, Sarah found herself walking alone through the darkened streets of San Antonio. The weight of what she had volunteered to do was beginning to settle on her shoulders, along with the realization that her next actions would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everything she had worked to build. The medicine bag that Running Bear had sent her months earlier felt warm against her chest, a reminder that she was not truly alone in facing the challenges ahead. But as she prepared for what might be her final contribution to the cause of peace, Sarah understood that the most dangerous part of her journey was just beginning. The abandoned silver mine 20 miles north of San Antonio had become the secret meeting place where hatred from both worlds converged in unholy alliance. Sarah crouched in the darkness behind a fallen timber, her heart pounding as she watched Marcus Steele shake hands with Bloodhawk in a gesture that would have been unthinkable to their respective followers. 3 weeks of careful infiltration had led her to this moment. Using her reputation as someone disillusioned with the peace process, she had made contact with both conspiracy factions, gradually earning enough trust to be invited to this crucial planning meeting. The intelligence she gathered here would either save the Great Alliance or die with her in this remote canyon. The final attack must appear to come from the Comanche, Steele was saying, his weathered face illuminated by the flickering light of a small campfire. When we massacre the Cherokee delegation, It needs to look like Running Bear ordered it to eliminate rivals for territorial concessions. Bloodhawk's scarred features twisted with savage satisfaction. And when my warriors attack the governor's escort tomorrow, it will appear that white soldiers violated the sacred meeting ground. Both sides will demand war, and this foolish talk of peace will die forever. Sarah fought to control her breathing as she realized the full scope of their plan. The conspirators intended to stage simultaneous false flag attacks that would frame both sides for atrocities they didn't commit, making reconciliation impossible and ensuring a return to the profitable cycle of violence that sustained their power. But her position behind the fallen timber also made her acutely aware of how precarious her situation had become. She was alone, miles from help, surrounded by armed men who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered her presence. The small derringer hidden in her boot would be useless against a dozen hardened killers, and her horse was tethered too far away to reach if she needed to escape quickly. "What about the Morgan woman?" asked one of Steele's lieutenants, a thin man with dead eyes who had been identified as the sniper responsible for her failed assassination. "She's still asking questions, still meeting with tribal leaders. Some of the boys think she's getting too close to the truth." Steele's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Sarah Morgan is a useful fool who thinks she can civilize savages through kindness and understanding. After tomorrow's attacks, she'll be too busy mourning the dead to interfere with our operations." The casual dismissal of her threat would have been reassuring if Sarah hadn't caught the subtle hand signal that passed between Bloodhawk and one of his warriors. The Comanche war chief suspected something was wrong, his experienced instincts warning him of danger his white allies hadn't detected. Sarah knew she had to leave immediately, but she also needed to hear the specific details of tomorrow's attacks to have any chance of preventing them. The dilemma was resolved when Bloodhawk rose abruptly from his position beside the fire, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the circle of light. "Someone watches us," he announced in English, his voice carrying the deadly certainty of a predator who had detected prey. The spirit's whisper of eyes that should not see, ears that should not hear. The effect on the assembled conspirators was immediate and electric. Weapons appeared in hands with practiced speed, while men spread out to search the surrounding area with methodical efficiency. Sarah realized that her concealment was about to be discovered, and her only chance of survival lay in turning the situation to her advantage. She stood up slowly, her hands visible but positioned near the derringer in her boot, and stepped into the firelight with calculated composure. "Gentlemen," she said in a voice that carried clearly through the sudden silence, "I believe you were discussing me." The shock of her appearance left everyone frozen for several heartbeats before weapons swung toward her from multiple directions. Sarah kept her hands steady and her expression calm, projecting a confidence she was far from feeling. "Miss Morgan," Steele said finally, his voice tight with surprise and growing suspicion, "what brings you to this remote location at such a late hour?" Sarah had prepared for this moment during the long ride to the mine, crafting a story that might keep her alive long enough to complete her mission. "The same thing that brings all of you, Mr. Steele. Concern about the direction of the peace negotiations, and a desire to explore alternatives that might better serve our respective peoples." Bloodhawk's eyes never left her face as he spoke in rapid Comanche to his warriors. Sarah didn't need translation to understand that he was ordering them to surround her while he evaluated this unexpected development. "You claim to oppose the peace process you helped create?" Bloodhawk asked, switching back to English with obvious skepticism. "This seems unlikely from one who has worked so hard to build trust between white and Indian peoples." Sarah took a calculated risk, drawing on her months of experience reading Comanche psychology and leadership dynamics. "Chief Bloodhawk, I have seen what peace negotiations really accomplish. They give the illusion of progress while allowing white expansion to continue unchecked. Your cousin Ironhawk was right to oppose my presence among your people. I was naive to believe that real cooperation was possible. The reference to Ironhawk and her acknowledgement of his warnings created exactly the response she had hoped for. Bloodhawk's expression shifted from suspicion to interested attention as he processed the implications of what she was saying. "Continue," he said simply. "The Great Alliance is designed to fail," Sarah continued, building her deception on foundations of truth that would make it more convincing. "It promises the tribe's partnership and respect, while actually facilitating territorial expansion and cultural assimilation. Governor Henderson and his advisors see it as a way to neutralize Indian resistance without the expense and political complications of military conquest." Steele was nodding along with this assessment, his expression showing approval for what he interpreted as Sarah's conversion to his worldview. "You're finally seeing the truth, Miss Morgan. Indians and whites can't coexist as equals. One race must dominate, and nature has determined that the superior civilization will prevail." Sarah forced herself to look thoughtful rather than disgusted by Steele's racist ideology. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Steele, but if that's the case, shouldn't we ensure that the transition happens in ways that serve our long-term interests, rather than creating unnecessary complications?" It was Bloodhawk who understood the implication first. "You propose to help us destroy the peace process from within, using your position to ensure that our attacks achieve maximum effect." "Exactly," Sarah replied, stepping closer to the fire, in a gesture that suggested increasing confidence in her reception. "I can provide intelligence about security arrangements, delegate movements, and strategic vulnerabilities that would make your operations far more effective." The next hour was the most dangerous of Sarah's life, as she walked the razor's edge between providing enough credible information to maintain her cover, while avoiding anything that would actually compromise the safety of people she was trying to protect. She confirmed details about tomorrow's attacks that the conspirators already knew, while subtly gathering intelligence about timing, routes, and personnel that would be crucial for prevention efforts. Most importantly, she learned that the attacks were scheduled to begin at dawn, with Bloodhawk's assault on Governor Henderson's morning escort, followed 2 hours later by Steele's massacre of the Cherokee delegation as they traveled to a ceremonial meeting ground. The timing was designed to create maximum confusion and prevent any coordinated response from territorial authorities. "One question remains," Steele said as the meeting began to wind down. "How do we know you won't betray us to your government friends? You're asking us to trust someone who's been working against our interests for months." Sarah had been expecting this challenge and had prepared her most dangerous gambit in response. "Because, Mr. Steele, I'm going to prove my commitment by personally leading Bloodhawk's warriors to the governor's escort. My presence will ensure that the attack succeeds and will make my complicity undeniable to territorial authorities." The audacity of her proposal left both faction leaders speechless. Sarah was essentially volunteering to participate directly in the assassination of Governor Henderson, the man who had trusted her with unprecedented authority and responsibility. Bloodhawk's eyes glittered with savage approval. "This would indeed prove your sincerity, Sarah Morgan, but it would also mean your death when territorial soldiers discover your role in the governor's murder." "Not if we time it correctly," Sarah replied, her mind racing through the desperate plan she was formulating even as she spoke. "If I appear to be taken captive during the attack, forced to guide you to the governor against my will, I can survive to provide intelligence for future operations." It was exactly the kind of complex deception that appealed to both Steele's racist paranoia and Bloodhawk's warrior pragmatism. After additional discussion about logistics and timing, the conspirators agreed to Sarah's proposal, not realizing that they had just provided her with everything she needed to destroy their entire operation. As the meeting dispersed, and Sarah rode back toward San Antonio through the pre-dawn darkness, she carried intelligence that would save dozens of lives while simultaneously positioning herself to expose the conspiracy in a way that no one could deny or dismiss. The plan she had conceived during those terrifying hours at the mine was elegant. In its simplicity, she would warn territorial authorities about both attacks while positioning herself to be captured by Bloodhawk's warriors in a way that would allow her to document their coordination with Steele's forces. When the dust settled, she would have irrefutable evidence of cooperation between white supremacists and hostile Indians, proof that would discredit both factions permanently. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. Sarah reached Governor Henderson's residence just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Her urgent knocking brought the governor's security detail to full alert, and within minutes she was briefing territorial officials about the imminent attacks while they organized emergency response measures. Miss Morgan, Governor Henderson, said as armed escorts prepared to accompany him on an altered route that would avoid Bloodhawk's ambush, "Your infiltration of this conspiracy has probably saved my life and prevented a war. The territory owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Sarah felt the weight of her deception pressing on her conscience as she accepted praise for heroism that was built on months of lies and half-truths. "Governor, the real test comes when we expose the conspiracy publicly. The evidence I'm gathering will only be credible if we can demonstrate the full extent of their cooperation." 2 hours later, Sarah found herself riding through the hill country north of San Antonio with Bloodhawk and 6 of his fiercest warriors, playing her role as reluctant guide, while territorial marshals tracked their movement from concealed positions. The complex choreography required split-second timing and perfect performances from everyone involved. When they reached the designated ambush site, Sarah's heart nearly stopped as she saw Governor Henderson's escort approaching exactly as Bloodhawk had planned. For a moment, she wondered if her warning had been ignored or if some terrible miscommunication had occurred. Then she saw the subtle signs that revealed the truth. The governor in the lead carriage was actually Marshal Thompson wearing Henderson's distinctive coat and hat. The escort soldiers were all volunteers who had agreed to participate in the dangerous deception. And concealed in the rocks above the road, territorial marksmen waited to document everything that was about to happen. The attack unfolded exactly as the conspirators had planned, except that instead of murdering a territorial governor, Bloodhawk's warriors found themselves captured in a carefully prepared trap, while their coordination with white supremacist forces was documented by hidden observers. The trials that followed became the most significant legal proceedings in Texas territorial history. Sarah's testimony, supported by irrefutable evidence of cooperation between supposedly implacable enemies, destroyed the credibility of extremist factions on both sides while vindicating the peace process they had tried to sabotage. Marcus Steele and his key lieutenants received lengthy prison sentences for conspiracy and attempted murder. Bloodhawk and his followers were handed over to tribal justice, where Running Bear's fair but firm leadership ensured punishment that served both justice and reconciliation. Most importantly, the exposure of the conspiracy strengthened rather than weakened the Great Alliance. When both peoples saw the lengths to which their enemies had gone to prevent peace, support for cooperation increased dramatically among moderate voices on both sides. The formal signing of the Great Alliance Treaty took place 6 months later, in a ceremony that brought together representatives from dozens of tribes and territorial officials from across the American frontier. Sarah stood beside Governor Henderson as he signed the document that would transform Indian-white relations. Throughout the region, her unique position as bridge between worlds finally recognized officially. But it was her private conversation with Running Bear after the ceremony that meant the most to her personal sense of accomplishment and belonging. "You have walked a dangerous path between two worlds, Sarah Morgan," he said as they stood together, watching the celebration that marked the end of years of warfare and the beginning of an uncertain but hopeful future. "The spirits guided your steps when the way seemed impossible to find." Sarah touched the medicine bag that still hung around her neck, hidden beneath her formal dress, but never forgotten. "I learned from the Comanche that courage means more than simply facing physical danger. Sometimes it means choosing to build something new instead of preserving something familiar." Running Bear nodded with satisfaction. "And now you have helped both our peoples learn that same lesson. The bridge you built between worlds will carry future generations toward understanding we could not have imagined when this began." As the sun set over the celebration that marked the birth of a new era in frontier relations, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a desperate hostage into the architect of lasting peace. The path between worlds had been dangerous, but it had also been necessary, and for the first time since leaving Cedar Ridge as payment for a treaty, Sarah felt that she truly belonged somewhere, not in either world exclusively, but in the space between them where understanding made impossible things possible. Years later, when historians studied the Great Alliance and its unprecedented success in preventing frontier warfare, they would identify Sarah Morgan as the crucial figure whose unique perspective and dangerous courage made peace possible. But Sarah herself always insisted that the real heroes were the leaders on both sides, who chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice, and hope over fear. The woman who had been taken as payment for peace had become the foundation upon which lasting understanding was built. And in that transformation, both peoples discovered that their greatest strength lay not in conquest or resistance, but in the wisdom to recognize that their futures were inextricably linked. Up next, you've got two more standout stories on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.